Hello, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Anurekha Charivag, Assistant Professor, Department of Sociology, Savitribai Phule, Pune University. I am coordinating the paper on Sociology of Gender. Today we are going to discuss the module Religion and Identity in India. In this module, we are going to discuss the relationship between religion, ethics and morality, and we will also be discussing the whole issues of crisis of secularism, especially in the context of nationalism. Further, we will also understand religion in the context of faith, belief and ethics. And lastly, but most importantly, we will also understand the relationship between religion, identity, especially in terms of religious identity and politics. Religion, sacred and profane, public and private. Emile Durkheim defined religion as a unified system of beliefs and practices relative to sacred things, that is to say, things set apart and forbidden. Beliefs and practices which unite into one single moral community called the church all those who adhere to them. The concept of the sacred and profane are central to Emile Durkheim's theory of religion. The distinctive trait of religious thought is that the world is divided into two domains, one containing all that is sacred and the other containing all that is profane. The sacred is always separated from all other subjects and embodies not only the gods, spirits and natural things, but beliefs, practice and rites as well. This reminds us the structure of the hierarchical caste system in India originating from Hinduism, where it is only the Brahmins who are eligible to perform certain rites. The profane, according to Durkheim, is subordinate in dignity to the sacred and therefore seen as radically opposite to the sacred. It is everyday, the commonplace, the utilitarian, the mundane aspects of life, which is made up of sensations coming from the physical world and of vulgar things that interest only our physical individualities. It is in this regard that, according to Durkheim, despite being so profoundly differentiated, the profane in principle with the capacity to contaminate the sacred. There are existing rules which regulate the separation between the two, and the precautions must be taken when they come in contact. The sacred and the profane thus present a unifying principle which separates the natural from the spiritual world. This provides society with a model of binaries such as good and evil, pure and polluted, holy and defiled, and so on. According to this binary, the politics of religion, including its gender politics and violence, will be placed in the domain of the profane, which should be separated from the sacred. In the contemporary global settings and the prevalence of communal violence around religious identities, one has to exercise great caution in applying this idea and in accepting the validity of the opposition between the sacred and the profane. Moreover, there exist varied diversities among Indian religion. Indian religions like Buddhism and Jainism are aesthetic. The Four Noble Truths of Buddhism, for example, which are regarded as a core of Buddha's teaching, are divorced from the idea of divinity. The indifference to divine in both Buddhism and Jainism, according to Durkheim, was derived from Brahmanism, where the numerous divinities merged themselves into an impersonal and abstract deity, the supreme reality contained within man himself. Women in religion. Bearers of religious tradition, victims of religious inequality. Women form an inherent part of the family as well as integral part of the religious communities. The personal laws are different from different religions. They are all discriminatory towards women. This is not surprising given the patriarchal nature of families as well as religious communities. They are symbolic figures for communities, especially during moments of real and conceived crises. For many women, religion is an individual equation of divine faith with their God. They live and inhabit religious norms and follow religious rituals without any external and social imposition. A religious act can be equated with an act of genuine faith, which is not merely a doctrine but a source of energy to nurture their lives. The effective, ethical and sensible capacities of women are highlighted in their acts of religious faith, and they have often derived their primary identity via religious preoccupation. Women are seen as devotees who use the mythical characteristics of religion and its ritual resources to construct an autonomous cultural space for themselves, which provide them with the scope to vest from belief and power from patriarchy. Thus, there is no reason to interpret religious assiduity in terms of submission or lack of agency. In Hinduism's ascetic traditions, the male renouncer has a conventional image where the emphasis is on celibacy, Vedic learning, and solitude. It is these characteristics of asceticism that make it least hospitable to women. There exists a persistent tension between the socially approved norms of women's responsible involvement with family life and the value of ascetic withdrawal from society for attaining liberation. Women do not constitute the community, they belong to it. It is the men who lead patriarchal families and communities. The membership of women is conditional to pre-existing rules, practices, conventions, definitions, and meaning. If they are obedient and loyal, they are rewarded, else they are punished and expelled. There exists a gender opposition between renunciation and the life of a householder. To become an ascetic, a woman has to initiate by rejecting the role of a good and virtuous wife, thereby facing opposition from family and friends. While the male ascetic makes a choice between two ideals in life equally allowed for him, the female ascetic is different in having renounced a single mode of life set for her and by adopting a behavior intended for the male counterparts. Men are glorified for renouncing their wives for the sake of God, while wife is expected to show unquestioning submissiveness to her husband. Moreover, women and their religious practices are part of the private, unlike men who are authorized to participate in the public. Within misogynist and religious ascetic tradition, women ascetics have faced opposition from the male peers. The behavior of women ascetics has been viewed as deviant or even dangerous. While Buddhism and Jainism have challenged and ridiculed Vedic ritualism and casteism, they continue to echo Hindu canons in their anti-woman expressions by describing the nature as dangerous. However, women renouncers have created a space and opportunities for themselves within this male space. Buddhism and Jainism have opened the doors of monastic living to women, serving as entry points by establishing several monasteries for women which were well organized according to the rules prescribed in the codes of monastic life. Hindu female asceticism, on the other hand, has largely remained unstructured, with no feminine version of monastic organization and an absence of homogeneity. The Bhakti movement enabled women to break the chains of canonical traditions, orthodoxy, and conventions which limited women's right to transcendence. Spiritual women shattered the binaries of the good woman, chaste wife, sacrificing mother, and the bad woman, public woman, prostitute. As a seeker of transcendence, a woman saint made unacceptable acceptable by rejecting marriage and motherhood. There was a strong historical presence of the ideologically marginalized ascetic woman. Bhakti movements were social movements where early bhaktas did not necessarily come from poorest classes, but they latter began to enlist people from all strata of society, including different castes and occupations, providing democratic access to God. People from the lower order of society and women found a way to counter their exclusion from Hindu upper caste ritual order and to escape the stigma which were otherwise forced to live with. Crisis of secularism. Colonial history of India, communities to religious communities. Of the total population of India in 2001, Hindus constituted 80.5%, while Muslims accounted for 13.4%, and Christians formed 2.3% of the total population, while Sikhs, Buddhists, and Jains were 1.9%, 0.8%, and 0.4% respectively. The other religions constituted 0.6% of the Indian population. According to the 2011 census, while Hindu comprised 78.35% of the total population, Muslims accounted for 14.2%, and the share of the Christians were little above 2%, as in the range of the 2001 census. It was the colonial bureaucratic rationality of India which was responsible for the creation of religious identity as a political category. In the colonial understanding of the Indian subcontinent, according to Gyanendra Pandey, religious self-identification in the society was considered a permanent and fundamental condition. This helped the British with the master strategy of divide and rule and served the interest of managing and governing colonized Indians. The colonized rulers created dissension and competition between Hindus and Muslims to prevent their alignment against the British rule. This representation of the colonized by religious identification elided the internally differentiated character of communities which were based on, say, caste, sect, etc. It further ignored the historically changing dimension of communities as they faced new contexts and conflicts. Communities were fixed by the two major colonial initiatives, census operations organized around religion and caste as the crucial determinants of Indian society. installation of separate electorates and forms of representation. This was a product of the Minto-Morley reforms 1909, reinforced by the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms 1919 and Government of India Act 1935, which consolidated and politicized competing communal identities. Thus, heterogeneously formed communities were transformed into religious communities, and certain chosen features, customs, and not others were applied fundamentally in creating these religious identities. Religious communities and nationalism, majority and minority. Colonial policies caused division and hostility between different religions and cultures, leading to the partition of the subcontinent in 1947. The latter was also caused by the certain assumption held by the majority of the Congress leadership that national solidarity was essentially a quality of India's Hindu cultural tradition, which led to generation of fear and defensiveness among Muslims and the demand and drive for a separate nation. For instance, Congress leaders such as Gandhi had accepted the idea of separate representation of Muslims by the way of concession, as for them the minority or communal question had no connection with the question of nationalism. It was one for nationalism to overcome. For others like Jinnah and Ambedkar, the resolution of minority question was at the heart of the problem, as that would decide the place that minorities would have in India. Pandey has pointed out that the Khilafat movement, when anti-colonial resistance was organized with the Muslim at the center of the nation, was the last movement in Indian nationalism where the nation and community were not opposed to each other. That movement saw India as a nation composed of communities. But soon after the movement, Gandhi went back to his earlier position, imbricating the question of religious difference within an opposition between nationalism and communalism. It was through the 1930s and 1940s that Muslim became a symbol of unassimilable difference, one who questioned the nationalist attribution of the singularity to the nation. While Gandhi believed that India would integrate Muslims in the organic unity of the nation as a family, Nehru was of the opinion that modernization would erase the backwardness of the Muslim as they would be assimilated in the national mainstream. Prakash thus argues that the projection of the Muslim as the other and the constitution of the modern Indian state were related projects, with one implying the other. Indian Muslims were finally rendered a minority in the independent India, a minority that the liberal nation state under the leadership of Nehru pledged to tolerate. Partition led to Congress refusing to reserve seats in separate electorates for any minority based on religion and faith. They went back on the promise of making Hindustani a national language and nominated Hindi in its place. Thus, while Britishers continued to perpetuate the policy of divide and rule on communal lines, Congress used religious idioms, specifically Hindi, to represent its secular demands. They, however, claimed to represent the cause of Indian nationalism as against the communal nationalism of the Muslim League or of the Hindu Mahasabha and the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh. Religion and state, identity politics, personal laws. All the four religious communities, namely Hindu, majority, minority Muslim, Christian and Parsi communities, have their separate personal laws. Other religious groups such as Sikh, Buddhist, Jain tribes and scheduled caste are all subsumed under the Hindu personal law. Personal laws operate in matters relating to inheritance, marriage, divorce, maintenance and adoption. This is because these are regarded as personal issues related to matters within the private sphere of the family. All personal laws reinforce the patriarchal, patrilineal, patrifocal family. The operation of separate personal laws for different religious communities in India is a legacy of British colonial administration as well. British administration made distinction between personal and other spheres of law, derived from the ancient distinction between territorial and personal laws. They did not interfere with the personal laws, which have the following salient features. 1. That they are attached to an individual at birth. Further, they have control and regulate social relations in private sphere, and that these laws are specific to and separate for particular religious communities, perceived as a means of securing community identity and respecting religious difference. Personal laws therefore operate within rather than despite a constitutional commitment to the secularism of the Indian state. Any proposed reform or removal of personal laws becomes a fraught issue and is perceived as a threat to the community identity and or traditional patriarchal arrangements. Personal laws were codified for administrative convenience, even by overriding or fixing customary laws. They did not necessarily have scriptural sanction. These codifications involve not just specific interpretation of each religion, but also incorporation of the assumptions of the colonial administrators and native representatives. Communities are far more heterogeneous with permeable boundaries. Their norms are much more flexible and overlapping than the political categorization done by the state would expect us to believe. While all communities were expected to be governed by the religious personal laws, Hindu personal laws were later codified after independence. Nehru brought codification of Hindu personal laws in 4 legislations: Hindu Marriage Act of 1955, Hindu Adoption and Maintenance Act 1956, Hindu Minority and Guardianship Act 1956, and Hindu Succession Act of 1956. All these legislations were discriminatory against women and were still passed after a great deal of opposition. However, personal laws of other religions were not codified when the process of secular reform to abolish all personal laws for a uniform civil code prior to independence was scuttled on the grounds of political expediency. It is important to note that 1980s was a decade of the rise of communal conflicts, majority-minority fundamentalism, caste wars and regional separatist movement. The vision of a homogeneous nation has been fractured. On the one hand, a nationwide debate was raised regarding Shah Bano controversy when the Supreme Court gave Shah Bano a lifelong maintenance via 125 Criminal Procedure Code, thereby violating Shariat law and interfering in the Muslim personal board laws. The Hindu right claim for a UCC citing Shah Bano case posed a challenge to the feminists, as the former claimed that it was the majority community members who were proper citizens, and the Muslims' choice not to implement a UCC made them anti-national and unpatriotic. Thus, the UCC became a site of both desire and threat, with the desire to achieve unity and homogeneity of the nation, and the threat to the minorities, as their claims to particularity were in danger of being subsumed by claims to a homogeneous nation. The UCC was by no way a means of achieving gender equality for communities. Muslim opposition to UCC was obvious, as it threatened the sanctity of the religious laws and hence the religious identity. They were apprehensive that UCC would actually be a version of the Hindu personal law which would be made uniformly applicable to all, thereby secure Hindu hegemony. During the 1980s, Roop covered self-immolation as Sati brought pro-Sati, anti-Sati women's group in confrontation. The latter demonstrations saw both groups shouting the same slogans of women's empowerment, initiating the process of right-wing appropriation of the slogans of progressive women's movement after the former's appropriation of the feminist agenda of the UCC. Religion, caste, gender, Mandal ka Mandal, Mandir, Masjid debates. In 1970s, there was an emergence of the new social movements as well as a challenge to the upper caste hegemony over national politics. A small but vocal political leadership emerged from the lower caste who had acquired education and entered bureaucracy and non-traditional occupations with the help of reserve policy. It was in the 1980s that the Second Commission for the Backward Classes, the Mandal Commission, proposed to extend reservation and jobs and educational states to the other backward classes in all states and union territories and at the central government level. On 7th August 1990, the Prime Minister V.P. Singh announced the government's intention to implement recommendations of the Mandal Commission, according to which there had to be an inclusion of backward classes for 27% additional reservation. The policy and proposal was strongly opposed by the sections of the upper and intermediate caste who were part of the middle class and who resisted the newly politicized lower caste, forcing their way into middle class white-collar jobs, that too through caste-based reservation and not competition. This resulted in the clash of interest between upper and intermediate caste on the one hand and lower caste on the other. There were young middle class women in Delhi who opposed these reservations and unmarked citizens with placards which said, "We want employed husbands." Thus, Mandal Masjid years in the 1980 brought forth a completely new political understanding of caste and the word Dalit. The non-Brahminical reconstructions of historiography of modern India have shown the histories of anti-hierarchical, pro-democratizing, collective objectives of the lower caste which were not highlighted in the dominant narratives of nationalism. In independent India too, the prevailing narrative of the nation building continued with the assumption that parochial structures of caste, community and tribe and various feudal vestiges would enter into new relationships of the secular and political kind. There was a supposition that secularism would undermine communal, religious as well as caste identities, and that with equal access to resources, opportunities and modern education, a single homogeneous middle class will emerge, leading to a new concept of unity based on national identity. There were accounts of intercaste violence at many places, and mandalization of politics resulted not only in radically altering the social basis of politics in India, but also paved the way for complex reformulations of Brahmanical patriarchies to counter collective Dalit resistance. It ended the era of Congress-dominated politics of social consensus, and many lower caste social groups abandoned the party for their own separate political parties. The categories of the OBC, SCs and the STs created the administrative need of implementing the reservation policy and attained a strong political and social status as the new socio-economic groups. These groups were interested in gaining political power, and the 1980s were marked by the newly exploding caste identity and consciousness. Sheth refers to this change in caste consciousness as also being related to a de-ritualization of caste in post-colonial India, which meant delinking of caste from various forms of rituality, which bounded it into a fixed status and occupation and to specific rules of commensality and endogamy. The newly acquired caste identity had resulted in the uprooting of caste from its ritually determined ideological, economic and political context, and the hierarchically ordered strata of caste functioned as horizontal groups competing for power and control over resources in society. The caste consciousness was no more dependent on ritual status. It was instead articulated as a political consciousness of groups taking claims to power and to new places in the changed opportunity structure arising out of development of a new power system created by elections, political parties, affirmative action of the state. In addition to this was the existence of multiple patriarchies, which led to discrete caste and overlapping patriarchal arrangements. The Indian Parliament passed the 73rd and the 74th Amendments, thereby introducing 1/3, 33% reservations for women in local self-government institutions, rural panchayats and urban local bodies in 1993. The arguments against the bill came from two broad opposing positions, either from the opposition in general to reservation or from a premise that reservations for women should be extended to other disempowered groups, that is quota within the quotas. An important turning point for the rise of Hindu right politics in India has been the Ram Janambhoomi movement, which laid bare the complex ways in which secularism was understood, as well as the complex relation between religious faith and politics. The movement claimed to be independent of any political manipulation and maintained that it was devoted to restoring the birthplace of Ram with a focus on asserting Hindu faith. The Hindu faith described above was critiqued by feminists because it was claimed to be a faith which was timeless and above historical change and political manipulation. They argued that there has been no mention of any urgency to build a temple on Babri Masjid site in any traditional text, ritual or myth prior to the Ram Janambhoomi movement. Moreover, since it is a woman who are believed to be the custodians of eternal faith and bearers of familial and community tradition, it seemed legitimate for them to respond to this call to preserve the age-old Hindu beliefs. The Mandal Masjidiers brought with them the fragmentation of the universal category of women when it became impossible to speak of women without reference to caste, class and community. Communalism and fundamentalism. The particularities of Indian partition 1947 can be immediately noted. Several 100,000 of people were estimated to have been killed. Innumerable and uncountable numbers were raped and converted. There were millions who were uprooted and transformed into official refugees due to the riots. Scholars have argued that religion is not the ultimate cause of communal conflict because the core of religion is its quest for ultimate reality, which is supra-rational and metaphysical. They have looked at the communal approach as being concerned with things purely mundane, political and economic interest. Hence, the vested interest lay at the root of communalism. Moreover, there is enough literature which draws our attention to the existing myth and the importance of discarding it of Muslim aggressiveness and Hindu defensiveness, of Muslim fanaticism and Hindu tolerance. While partition led to realignment of borders and of national and community identities, there was not essentially a realignment of loyalties. Scholars have shown how large number of people choose fidelity to place rather than to religious community. They converted and remained there. There were women who spoke about how they relearned their roles in a new location. Urvashi Butalia focuses on the individual experiences and their private pain in this experience to show how people on the margins of history have been affected by the upheaval of partition. She shows how, at least in private, the voices of partition have not been stilled and the bitterness of the events remain. Partition further made secularism a fraught idea at the time of framing of the Constitution, and as a result, the term secularism had to wait till 1976 to enter the Constitution. There were contradictions in the values and actions, and secularism was supposed to exemplify after independence premised on an apparent opposition between the ideas of Nehru and Gandhi. In contrast to Nehru's vision of Dharma Nirapekshata, which was based on the belief to separate religion and politics, Gandhian approach to secularism was based on Sarva Dharma Sambhava, Equal respect for all religion, let all religions prosper. It was the Gandhian approach which has dominated legal and political thought since independence. It does not advocate strict separation between religion and politics, but promotes equality of all religions within political as well as private life. All citizens must have equal right to freedom of religion, and the state must not discriminate on the basis of religion. Family and community honor is thus linked with women. The imagery of communal rights is all about gender stereotypes. The same story applies to other kinds of othering, be that of a Dalit man or a Adivasi, etc. Fundamentalism constructs a particular vision of religion as the only valid representation of that religion, allowing for little distinction between what is textual and what are local specific cultural practices. In conclusion, in this module on religion and identity, we discussed about the various facets of religion in India. What is most interesting to note that the Indian state have played a very important role in shaping and defining the role that religion would play in the life of everyday people in India. Further, using examples of UCC, that is Uniform Civil Code, using examples of nationalism, secularism in India, using the arguments of feminists, especially with regard to Shabano case, the module writer has really explained the way religion, identity and politics have complexly intervened with one another to create an interesting debate of the role of religion that plays in constructing everyday identities of people in India.